It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Nicholas Stern from the London School of Economics and Professor Himanshu from the Jawaharlal Nehru University to the IDFC Institute. I'll be speaking to them today on their new book, How Lives Change, Palanpur, India and Development Economics, which is they've co-authored with Peter Lanyau. Palanpur is a small village in Uttar Pradesh, and it has been the subject of a path-breaking study, a longitudinal survey which has gone on for 7 decades. It offers a microcosm of the changes that have happened in rural India over these 7 decades since independence. So Nick, thanks for coming. Himanshu, thanks for coming here. If I could start with you, Nick, could you take us through some of the background about what the Palanpur survey is, and also the very fascinating story of how you have been involved in it for, I think, close to 45 years?
Yes, it is about 45 years now. The story starts really during 73 and early 74, when Christopher Bliss, who's a friend and academic colleague, and I were thinking about going to India. We'd decided separately to go to India. We discovered the other was doing it. So we were thinking about research projects, research programs. At that time, in the early 70s, there were major discussions about what was called the Green Revolution and what its effects were. And there was some controversy. At the same time, there was really a resurgence of interest amongst economic theorists on economic development, in rather a good sense. I mean, as always, some lines of inquiry were perhaps less interesting, others turned out to be more interesting, but there was a lot of discussion about tenancy and factor markets and its role in the allocation of resources, its role in productivity, its role in risk. So those two subjects, as it were there and being discussed for two economists largely of theoretical bent who in any way were planning to go to India. We went to Indian Statistical Institute, where our friends were, very special friends, Bagich Minhas, T.N. Srinivasan and Kirit Parikh. The two key figures in getting me to India personally were people I'd met before I went to India, a good bit before, Manmohan Singh and T.N. Srinivasan, names which will be enormously well known to you all. And we didn't want to get drawn in to the planning story. It was really towards the end of the planning story, and we felt that the really interesting challenges around development were in rural India then. So we were thinking of the Green Revolution. It was about change, so you have to ask yourself, if you're studying change, well, you better find somewhere where there's a benchmark. So you can see how we're zeroing in, and we wanted somewhere where the studies previously were good. We wanted somewhere which was not too far from Delhi, because we were giving some lectures in the Indian Statistical Institute, which was on the 5th floor of the Yojana Bhavan. But it had to be far enough away not to be in Delhi's hinterland. We wanted somewhere, of course, where wheat was important, because Green Revolution was an issue. We wanted something where tenancy was important, because tenancy was an issue. And we wanted somewhere where we could live independently of any household. Because, I mean, Indian villages are like French villages and English villages. You know, there are factions and groups, and you don't want to be associated with any one in particular. So if you put all those criteria together, it's a tough ask. But nevertheless, out of India's 600 and something thousand villages, there were a few that met our criteria. And I think I can't remember now, we went to 5 or 6. And so we alighted on Palanpur. In large measure for 2 reasons, out of the 5 or 6. The other criteria narrowed it right down. But out of the 5 or 6, I think there were 2 reasons that took us to Palanpur. The first was the outstanding quality of the first 2 studies. And Himanshu and I have discussed this often, actually, going back again it is remarkable how good those first two studies were, 57, 58, 62, from the Agricultural Economics Research Centre, University of Delhi. And the second, there really was somewhere in Palanpur where we could live independently, which was above the seed store, where the village level worker was allocating fertilizer. And you know that you don't have to be an economist to work this out. If you're allocating a rationed product, then there is money to be made. And so he didn't stay there. He lived in a nearby town. So that's how we got there. And that was 74-5. And then I was teaching in ISI in 81, 82. And there was this very young, very thin, very tall white person in the audience who turned out to be Jean Drèze. I was lecturing on cost-benefit analysis. It was quite clear that he knew probably more about cost-benefit analysis than I did. But we got to talk to each other, and then he became interested, and he was the leading figure in the 83-84 study, along with Naresh Sharma, another ISI student at the time. We managed to publish the first study in 82, just as we were conceiving the next study. And then seemed to take us a long time to write these books. So Jean and Naresh felt that it was taking so long to write the next book that they'd better do another study, so they did in 93. And by then, it had become a time series of cross sections. And then, with Himanshu's leadership, it became more than a time series of cross sections. It became a longitudinal study. And so we designed the next one, 2008, 2010, to be a longitudinal study, which meant a lot of work on the earlier data to be able to bring it into conformity, that kind of conformity you needed. So sorry, it's a long answer to a simple question, but that's because it's been going on so long.
No, it's a fascinating story, actually, and sometimes we underestimate the backstories of big research projects or theoretical papers. They do tell you something important.
And I should just say, the quality of the data, I think, is very good right from the beginning. But in 83-4 and in 2008-10, even more so the latter, the quality is absolutely outstanding, because even in the first study, we were there for 8 or 9 months. And then Jean was there for a year and a half or so, 15 months, year and a half. And then Himanshu and the team, 2 years. And so much of what you need to find out takes time. And there are some lessons on quality of data that are really rather important.
So Himanshu, first of all, a quick sense of how you got involved in the Palanpur studies, and then perhaps we can move on to what the broad lessons have been. But if you could just sort of very briefly say how you got involved in this project.
I was a student, actually. I was doing a PhD. I had worked on poverty and had published a paper with Abhijit Sen, cutting the Angus Deaton's paper, and written something on wages. This is early 2000. And Jean, obviously, I was corresponding with him and met him and all that. But I had a curiosity to go to see it in the village on my own. And I was scouting for places, so I went to APSAT villages also. And John took me to Palanpur in 2003. And I got interested in that, but somehow I was completing my PhD, and I just, so it took us some time before we finally, I could find Nick and Nick could find me in LSE. We were in LSE, and then we met, and I was telling him that I wanted the old data because I want to go to Palanpur. He had all that in LSE at that point of time, and he said that he wanted to go to Palanpur. And that's how we decided to go and work out. And since then it has been like, so since 2007 actually we have been on this. So now it's 12 years that I've been on it.
So Nick, probably 14 years since the first discussion, right?
Yeah. So Nick, what are the broad findings of the latest study, which is what the book is about, in terms of both change in the economic well-being of the people of Palanpur, also the structural change in the rural economy over these years?
Well, let me paint some of the picture, because then Himanshu, I'm sure, should paint some other parts of it. And let's take the sweep of the whole period of time. Very crudely, and this is too sharp, but crudely, there's two periods. The period from the mid-50s to the late 70s, early 80s, which was largely about, in terms of growth, was largely about agricultural investment. And the Zamindari abolition meant that there was more confidence in investing in land. So the land went from, I can't remember exactly, 20-30% irrigated in the 50s to virtually everything irrigated by the time you got to the middle of the 70s. I mean, not great quality irrigation, but irrigation. Persian wheels, basically, first, then 10 centimetre bores and diesel pumping sets. So that expansion of irrigation, along with the new varieties, but it basically was investment in land and to some extent investment in machinery that drove that story. And the new seeds came with it. And the second part of the story is an increasing involvement in the outside labour market. And it mostly is informal jobs. Actually, the formal jobs were there, but they didn't really grow. And that's a very important part of the story. Mostly commuting, and around about an hour and a half or so away, and Chandosi half an hour or so away on the train. I mean, not many trains, but and there are buses and so on.
So informal manufacturing or informal services?
Informal. I sometimes think that the distinction is overdone, yeah, because some of it is brick making, some of it is marble polishing, construction-related activities. So if you make a brick or you polish a marble or you make a table, why would you agonize too hard about the classification of the story? Moving bags around in the rail yard in Muradabad, most of us would think of as services. Yeah? But still, So in most definitions, if construction is with services, then it's with services mostly. But as I say, we don't agonize too much about that particular classification. But informal is very important. And it is mostly informal and it's mostly commuting. And in that process, some people move quicker than others. Some people move first. That's the Kuznets insight. It's Deng Xiaoping. Some people get richer before others. It's also common sense. So that's a very broad brush. Income per capita over the period, roughly 2% or so, up and down because it's agricultural and so on. So in the first 2-3 decades, not far off India's growth rates, but of course lower in the last 3 decades or so. The changes are visible. I mean, Kutcher House is mostly, or nearly all actually, even in the 70s when we were there, now nearly all Pakka houses, including for the Jatabs, the Dalit community. And clothes, you see shoes on, I mean, it might not be fancy shoes or plastic sandals or something, but most feet have shoes on, and so really visible economic progress. Rice was building when we were there in 74, almost absent in the 50s. I mean, because you need the water. And then sugarcane was already quite strong then. But then it moved into other crops like mentha and so on. So those were big changes, and with them came changes in the agricultural and factor markets within the village, because the Jatabs, the agricultural workers by caste, essentially in the village, had greater options outside, had some liquidity they could rent. Technology switched from bullocks pulling the plough to tractors. So a combination really of outside opportunities, technology through mechanization and the release of labor, and social relationships. Those three things together they each affect each other, and they each produce the results in terms of how allocations of resources and how means of livelihoods change. So that's the big story of change. I've touched just a little bit on agriculture, but perhaps on the whole poverty, mobility side, Himanshu, you might want to...
Yeah, actually I wanted to ask Himanshu two related questions. First, I think today Palanpur, about 50% of its sort of product would be outside of agriculture, its incomes, or more than that, right? So it's a village which, like story of most Indian villages today. But what I want to know is, as Nick said, because of the economic mobility, in India every problem is overlaid with the problem of social structure, right? How did that affect social mobility and caste dynamics? And second is, a lot of the change happened within the village, but was there any exogenous push from state programs?
The question on caste is something which is a very interesting question, in the sense, in some ways the social relations have changed, and the caste structure has also changed. The form of relations in that sense has changed dramatically. I mean, certainly not the kind of old style caste relations where there is untouchability or visible forms of caste relations. But caste is emerging as a category, and which is what we point out, and I'll come back to it a little later. But what has happened after the first part, which is the agriculture-led part, and the second part, which is the outside jobs and the non-farm becoming important. Agriculture was something which was very much linked to access to land. And the Jatabs, the Telis who didn't have access to land, and the Muslims traditionally didn't have, they were the ones who did not benefit to the same extent. So if you look at the gap between the Jatas versus the rest of the village, in the first 30 years, 25 to 30 years, that gap doesn't seem to be narrowing down or doing anything. When the non-farm sector opens up is when the Jatabs, and particularly because it has happened in the informal sector, where you don't require much of skills or education or something like that, they have been a big beneficiary of that. And they have basically been a beneficiary of this outward mobility. They have, as a group, benefited. But it's not to say that all Jatabs have improved. It still is dependent on, that's when inequality plays a role. It still is dependent on networks. I mean, it is just you don't go and get up and go to a town and you find a job there. And you need somebody to. So networks, contacts are there for self-employed, those who are doing marble polishing or other things, or you're opening up a mechanic shop for motorcycle repairing. You need some capital. So those things are still important. It has not become completely neutral in that sense. But the Jatabs have now have benefited out of it, and they are asserting their incomes have improved. So as a group, they have become much closer to the rest of the village in that sense. That's a very visible sign. Government policies have played both in terms of direct transfers to the village, which we actually measured in the sense how much is actually going to the money, each and every amount in that sense. But it also the political change, and two political changes, exogenous changes you're talking about. I mean, 73rd, 74th amendment were a big change. I mean, the village never had kind of an election as such to a panchayati body, and those elections are being held after the 73rd, 74th amendment, and the seat was reserved when we were in 2007 to 2012 for a Dalit Pradhan in the civil caste, and 2012 to 2017 it was for women. Now that's a big change, a Dalit becoming a head. Not that the Dalits have become politically influential, but it does force the Thakurs and the Muraus and others to build alliances with them, and so they at least have some bargaining power that comes with them. So that has obviously the exogenous change is a very big change. Money that is flowing through either the Finance Commission grants that directly go to panchayats, or through NREGA or ICDS, midday meal, social pensions. I mean, all of these are there. A lot of RTI and other things have basically brought in a kind of an accountability. I mean, and so we had a very interesting event when the village Pradhan was impeached. The villagers felt that he was corrupt and did that. So there is obviously the caste has changed. Exogenous changes have played a role in that sense. But a lot of that has also to do with the changing scenario, the changing economic profile of the area itself. And the big exogenous change is the opening of the economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, had that obviously did create various things. Mobiles have played a role, roads have played a role. So I think looking at combining these two things, these two have played a role. But there is one thing which I would like to point out. Even the first period, the state's role was very, very important. Like whether in terms of institutional changes and Zamindari revolution, in fact in the Green Revolution period. But this is the period which has come with changes where changes have been accompanied by increasing inequality. In some senses, the role of public investment has been not so important, I mean, except at least directly to the village. But in terms of overall policy framework, it did impact the village.
So these two periods you've spoken about, one is the pre-Green Revolution period when institutional change such as the abolition of Zamindari and sort of gave a fillip to rural investment and productivity, and then the Green Revolution. Now going forward, this shift
They're both within the first 30 years.
Yes. Yeah. Now you have seen gradual diversification of the economy of Palanpur, and therefore I guess in lots of other villages also it's a very similar thing. What should policy makers do to sort of accelerate this change? And there's something which struck me, and I've spoken somewhere about the importance of mobility, connectivity, communication and markets, and this is something which the IDFC Institute also tries to figure out, that what is the role of all these things. So could you, if I were to ask you a policy question, that Palanpur has come so far, now to accelerate that economic change and the social change, what should a policy maker be looking at?
Again, we should probably share this one.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, there are some things you should definitely be doing more of, and some things you should be careful about making mistakes. I think health and education in this new world where going outside the village for work is going to become more and more important. There's no way that's going backwards. It's going to intensify. So you ask yourself the question, the people of rural India, the people of Palanpur, are going to go outside for jobs. How will they fare? How will they do when they go outside? And there it seems pretty clear that their human capital will become increasingly important. If their incomes are to go up more quickly, then they have to bring more to that market, that labour market. And you can't make a long career out of moving bags around in rail yards. And it's not clear that the piece rate for making bricks is going to go up very rapidly. So how could people, as they go out into this growing economy, which will be growing, I mean, on average at 7%, we suppose, hope, then I think their skills and their health will become more and more important. So I would put that high on the list. We know that in an economy which is, 8% or so formal sector, of which a big chunk is public employment, that over this next 20 years, the scope for absorbing India's young people into the formal sector has to be just very limited numerically. Even if the 8% doubles in that time, I mean, who knows whether it will or not, maybe not, but even if it doubled in that time, that would be a small amount of employment in relation to the number of people. So that immediately poses the challenge under the heading of what we mentioned about being careful. Be careful in your enthusiasm to formalize, not to choke off opportunities. This isn't a campaign against formalization, quite the opposite. But be careful, because you can do it in ways. And let me just give you one example. Here was Nane, a very entrepreneurial Tele, who found work repairing machines or motorcycles, and turned out to be quite good at it. And then he acquired some of his own machinery, set up by himself, started hiring his friends and his family and other people close to him. And it built up, and he made some money, and then he invested in a Mensa oil crusher, and eventually became one of the best off, I mean, not rich, obviously, by Indian standards, but one of the better off or best off people in the village. And the caste came up, well, the Muslims, Delhi Muslims came up with him. And it's important to let that kind of thing happen, not to get in the way. You know, if he'd had to fill in as he changed from being a motorcycle mechanic to being somebody who was running a repair shop, if he had to fill in 150 different forms and satisfy a few babus on the way, I guess he wouldn't have done so well. So take care. I say it's very important not to be misunderstood here, because from the point of view of tax revenue, from the point of view of safety and all these things, as time goes by, some formalization is a good thing. But be careful, because the big growth is going to be in the informal sector, and you want to let that happen. That's the big chunk of your 7%.
So the sort of transition which, say, someone like Arthur Lewis had predicted, you know, and we did see it in many Asian countries. Are you saying that the Palanpur story suggests that it may not happen in India, or it'll happen much more slowly? I mean,
it'll happen differently. I don't think more slowly, actually, but differently. Lewis and, you know, I started doing economics only a dozen or so years after his paper was published, so it always seems quite new to me, but obviously to everybody else, not so new. He described a story of a backward sector, a kind of classical reserve army with not much capital involved, and saw the process of development as the formal capitalistic sector with two particular features: capital, of course, and profit maximization, where you're hiring labor at the wage where it's being supplied by the reserve army. So quite a classical, to some extent, Marxist model. And he saw that backward sector as not being a driver of growth. And he saw the employment in the other sector as being quite formal capitalistic. Well, neither of those two things is true for a description of Palanpur's history. Initially, Palanpur started to move through investment in agriculture, capital investment in agriculture. And there was lots of entrepreneurship there. I mean, we think of entrepreneurship, very reasonably, I think, as recognizing an opportunity and taking a risk to take that opportunity. It fits most people's views of entrepreneurship, I hope. The villagers of Palanpur did exactly that when they invested in irrigation. They're doing exactly that when they find out about outside jobs, get a mobile phone so that you can have more easy access to it, or like Nane, buying some equipment, or like the people in marble polishing, starting off renting it, then buying the marble polisher. All these examples. Even Jatab's going to brick kilns. You know, you're picking up the family, going off for a few days, and coming back. You're making an investment, taking a risk to take an opportunity, having recognized the opportunity. So that story of a kind of sluggish, non-capital using, backward sector is not a good description. And it's not a good description it errs in a way which is very important in the context of what was really happening and trying to understand it. And secondly, the idea was you quit that sector, went to the other sector, and there you were in this new thing, and that's where you worked all the time. And that's not like that, because well, it was Himanshu particularly who was using the word pluriactivity, and it's a slightly inelegant word, but it's actually a word which captures well. It is a number of activities. The family is doing a number of activities, and they're commuting to do it. So that's not like the description of employment in the advanced sector. So as a story of development, as a transfer from a rural agricultural set of activities to activities which are outside agriculture, some of which are in towns, not all of them, the Lewis story has a lot to offer, and it helps. But there are very important ways in which its story of development, and indeed its story in which you'd think about policy towards development, would look different. It has savings. I mean, a third way, it has savings out of profits, and that's what drives investment. Well, we saw people in Palanpur saving to invest in agricultural equipment. So if you look at the nature of jobs, if you look at the nature of the backward sector, the nature of entrepreneurship, where capital is, where saving comes from, these are very big differences from the Lewis model, which really matter to thinking about the process and understanding the process of development, and indeed when you come to policy.
So Himanshu,
that's not to say that Lewis was a really great man in our subject, and then he drove a lot of things which were really, really helpful. He brought the analysis of growth and distribution, which was there in Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. He brought it back to centre stage. He was thinking about the dynamics when most people were thinking about the statics. He was thinking about developing countries when most people were not. Right, you put that together, growth and distribution, dynamics, thinking about developing countries. There's a great man.
So Himanshu, since Nick spoke about your idea of pluriactivity, right, that the average poor family actually has several occupations. Now, there are two ways of looking at it. One is it acts as an inbuilt insurance, that if there's a shock in any one activity, there's something else. But the other is that you're denied the opportunity to specialize, and therefore there is, in a way, it's a suboptimal equilibrium that you don't actually manage to maximize your income. So could you just tell us a bit about this change, and how do you look at this issue of the poor having several activities?
Yeah, that's, in fact, when we use the word entrepreneurship for poor, it was like there was a reaction in the sense. What we said, we said that even the Green Revolution, when the illiterate villagers were taking up to a completely new technology, and within 10 years mastering the whole technology, it required some kind of risk-taking ability and their ability to adopt to a completely new way of doing things. Now, the poor are always trying to do that, and this is something which is, and that's where the dynamism comes. The place is a dynamic place in that sense. But you're right about one thing, which is what you said in the beginning. It's basically an insurance mechanism, and when you see that most of these jobs are informal jobs, which is where brick kilns don't work throughout the year. Even marble polishing is. There is ups and downs that is going on, and there are lots of enterprises which close down and then they open up new ones. But they're constantly doing this. But they do realize that at some point of time, they need to have their feet firmly on the ground. So agriculture is something that they keep holding on to it. But agriculture is also something which is very important for them in different ways, in terms of food and other related aspects of it. The pluriactivity in that sense is something which is a form of diversification, and I don't see that it's a question of specialization in that sense. Over a point of time they do that. Even migration is something that doesn't happen in one shot. Our study of migration suggests very clearly that people do 2, 3, 4 attempts before they finally migrate. Not every time the first movement is a successful one. So they go there, they 2, 3 months, then they don't feel, and they come back, and then again they try, and it's some kind of an exposure to the urban market that leads to. It's a process which is gradual process, and that's which is very different from the Lewis kind of model. Not everybody can be absorbed in the formal sector. We're talking about people who are manual laborers, people who are cultivators, who don't have any formal educational degree or skills in that sense to get absorbed in the formal market. Pluriactivity allows them to diversify. It basically gives them the scope, gives them the freedom to experiment with certain things without necessarily moving away from one place to other. And that's where commuting becomes a very important part of it. And the range has increased over a period of time, and so they are trying different things in different ways. But look at it from the other side also. It is basically coming from the vulnerabilities which are there in the market outside. So while we do say that the outside market is the one which has allowed them to explore and incomes to grow, but it's still not giving them the security that is available even with whatever declining and fluctuating incomes in agriculture. And that is a big question in terms of policy that you were asking, and the big question that you had as to what should be doing. The policy fluctuations in that sense are something which are equally bad for the informal sector, not just for the agriculture sector, which is going through a crisis at this point of time. Sad part is actually that we don't have a policy on the largest sector which employs outside agriculture. I mean, we have an industrial policy, we have a trade policy, we have all sorts of policies, but this country never had a policy on the small and medium enterprises in that sense, a holistic kind of a policy. But that's where lots of people are going in. But the vulnerabilities in those sectors are the ones which are also pushing them into retaining one element of. But there is second part of it, which is where the village becomes important, which is that village is not just an economic entity; it is also a social entity, and in some ways it is becoming a kind of a residential place. In the sense, for marriages you come back, for other things that you come back, people after retirement come back, and so you do maintain those social relations. So I don't see agriculture immediately moving away. I mean, people moving away and lock, stock, barrel moving to the urban areas or informal jobs in that sense. It's a process which will become on its own a formal process. People will move to better quality jobs, better kind of enterprises, higher level of capital in the enterprises itself. But policy options are not just to do what you should do, but also what you should not be doing. And I think those messages are very clearly pointed out by this.
Perhaps you should say a little bit about within caste inequality and how these processes inform the understanding of within caste inequality and across caste inequality. And Himanshu already described how the outside opportunities had brought up the Jatabs where it wasn't so true in the part of the story dominated by agricultural growth. But also the within caste inequality, which is particularly important here, is directly influenced by these development processes that we're describing, because within a caste, some people will take these opportunities before others. And at the same time, some castes will be better informed and have better structures to take these opportunities than others. So both things are happening. But it turned out to be, maybe you should add something, the within caste story turned out to be particularly powerful, that you got big within caste inequality increases.
Yeah, I mean the non-farm jobs that we're talking about within the village as well as outside the village, I mean, it still requires social connections and capital, these two things, and the role of that, and that is where largely private, basically the private market. Some kind of inequality we do see coming down, and that will be through education and health. That's where the government has failed, and the public sector has failed to create enough infrastructure or to quality of education, quality of health services. Those things, the absence of those are actually aggravating some of these inequalities, and we do see that becoming a stumbling block.
I mean, we've said in the past, we thought that education, each time we do these studies, we make predictions, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. But we've said education is coming and it's going to make a difference. We said that last time when we were doing the 83, 84, the 93 studies, and it was wrong. Because these jobs were largely unskilled, and actually the education didn't pick up all that fast. It was picking up. But in the last few years, say 10 years, it has picked up strongly, and also for girls. So we're making that prediction again, that next time round it'll be big. But that just underlines the point that Himanshu was making, that that education is going to become important, and it'll be so much more productive if it's done better.
So I have a question actually on the methodology, right? That we live in an era where big data is often spoken about, not often, you just keep hearing about it. Then you have your large census, your sample surveys. This is a very specific, almost ethnographic sort of study of a village in mind. But that also has immense insight. So do you think that, since this is a research organization, do you think that sometimes we underplay the importance of these very micro studies?
Yes, but why doesn't Himanshu?
Absolutely,
Yes,
absolutely, in a sense. Interesting thing is that, in fact, all three of us in some ways, I mean, much less in terms of me. But Peter Lanyau and me, I mean, we both started working on NSS data, the big data in that sense. That's where a lot of work was there. But so when we went to the village and we wanted to understand this, that's when you realize that it's not just about the volume of data, but the quality of data is also very important. And I'll give you one anecdote, which is a very interesting anecdote in that sense. Something very important for people to be careful about when you're doing surveys. It doesn't mean that all surveys, but when we started doing the survey, the first thing that we did was, anybody does is a demographic block, which is where you have family members' details, how much land do you own, leased out, leased in, and all sorts of things. And we did that, and we then a few months later, when the agriculture season started, we were doing the cultivation schedule, how much input do you put in, and obviously that is through each and every parcel of land, and so we're doing it for each plot of land. And we found some discrepancy between the data when we aggregated the plot level data with that. So we were a little puzzled. We went to the revenue department and we got all the land records, which is 1500 of them. We matched that. We had the satellite data and very good GIS mapping and everything. We find that it is a completely different kind of an information. But finally we had an old style geographer who said that, let me help you out, and he went to the field, French guy, with a compass and pen and paper, and he went around the whole village and he drew a map of the village. While he was doing so, I mean, obviously there's a white French person doing this thing. So some villagers were following us. So they said, that, what are we doing now? And we said that we are measuring the land. He said, we already told you. But I said, you lied to us. And then I asked him, that why did you give me the wrong information? He said, we didn't think that you were going to stay here. See, the respondent has an incentive to get you off your back. So not every data that you collect the very first time, you assume to be right. But I think this is not about the big data and small data. What we were interested was not in estimates. So when we say estimates of poverty in Palanpur, it is not about the numerical estimates. We were more interested in the processes as to what exactly is driving those. We were more interested in the relationships. So some of the issues that we got on, say for example, on caste relations, how caste clustering in occupations is happening, and why exactly people are using those caste as an element of economic mobility. We call it as communities of trust. In the sense, a Jatab or a Teli finds another Jatab or a Teli to be much more trustworthy. Not that he is the most efficient one, simply because he has some kind of affinity on cultural and other factors. You can see that happening in UK, you can see that happening in US, you see that happening here in Mumbai and other places.
Absolutely.
And so you have these regional identities playing role. I mean, you have those issues becoming important. And you see that there. You see that working in the credit market. You see that working in the land market in terms of tenancy relations. You do give to your same caste much more than to the other caste. You see that in the labor market, where there is a clustering that is happening. All people who are marble polishers tend to be of a particular group. People who are of a particular brickkill are of a particular group. Kaivan Munshi has a paper on Kathwadi.
Even on the Bombay textile.
So you see that happening even in the modern one. But why is it that caste is appearing in a different forms? Because it plays a very important role. Now you can't get this from even if you have 1 billion observations, because it is about, or for example, the intergenerational mobility that we managed to do. In a sense, we have information on 3 generations of it. So what happened to your grandfather sometimes?
This is the panel, right? So okay.
We had census of the village. Every time it is a census of the village. So sometimes a big event that happened to your grandfather may explain your own choices or your father's choices and
your opportunities.
Or your opportunities and why you suddenly went down. I mean, maybe something happened, something. So again, the kind of intergenerational mobility issues, or for example, or a simple question on welfare measurement. I mean, we had 6 different ways of, it seems to be very easy, go and ask a person what is your income. On the ground you go, it is the most difficult question to do. And you don't find any correlation between many of these estimates. And you have a perfect explanation for it as to why it is. It is not a random event. And we do have explanations on why certain factor markets, why new forms of tenancy evolve, why new forms of labor market evolve. Now, those are questions which cannot be answered. And I think it depends on what is your purpose. I mean, this was a question that we had. If you're interested in working on the impact of climate change, I mean, you obviously are not going to do micro studies. But if you're interested about behavior, interested about factor markets, then no amount of information is going to give it.
But actually, Himanshu, if you're interested in what is the fundamental question of development economics, actually the fundamental question of economics is how lives change.
Yeah. You can. Yeah.
Well, how do you find out how lives change? Well, you try and watch how lives change and get data on how lives change, which means following people. And that's so rare in our subject. And you're not just following individual people, you are, but not just that. You're following them in the environment and the economy and the societies in which they live and interact and depend on other people.
But
so there is no theoretical social welfare function we are taught. It's actually the lives of
lives of people.
Lives of people. Yeah.
But we are not saying that there's it's between small data versus big data. I think there is utility, and when we do that's what we did. I mean, we brought in our experience of large scale data that we have worked in, the other data set that we have brought in for those questions, and idea is to merge all form of it. And since when Peter is working, he's bringing his own work that he has done in Honduras and other places. I bring in my own work that he has, and expect his years of experience of being with World Bank and different places. So we bring it all together. So I don't think this is a question of one versus the other.
Yeah.
It's a question. The question is to how to define the question. And once you have defined your question, then the
methodology follows.
But what we would say, if you don't bring these data, then you're missing something big.
Yeah.
And you render it very difficult to understand the question which is the main question, which is how lives change. So these are complementary. But if you leave this one out, you're losing something that's pretty fundamental to your ability to understand change.
So Nick, one last question. What next?
Well, what next for Palanpur is a predictive question, which we've tried. What next? The one most confident prediction that we make is that there'll be another few studies of Palanpur. There is one for every decade since independence, and 30 years from now we'd like to be able to say the same thing. There is one for every decade since independence. So the centenary will be dated from the first study, will be in 1957. Yeah? That's not long after my 100th birthday, so I'm planning to be around. But of course, there is a risk that I will not be. But in that case, in any case, Himanshu will be leading the charge. So that's one prediction that we make. In the discussion, we referred to the importance of education, because if these are outside jobs, the quality that you bring to the labour market will be more important to the rise in your income than it has been in the past, when just getting the job, the unskilled job, was important to your rise in income. It's probably the case that more migration will take place. As people work outside, they learn more. Then, as a few people go, then there's kind of an S-curve, because if they're communities of trust, then once a few people have gone, then you can go and be with them. So, role of education, very important. Migration is going to be very important. The issue of communities of trust, and we're guessing now, speculating a bit, is likely to stay, because if you migrate, you're going to go with people you know. If you go further afield, maybe it's even more important that you have somebody to look after you, because the risks are a bit bigger. So the nature of caste and social relationships will change, but this idea of there being a community of trust seems to be something that's quite likely to stay strong. Climate has not yet played a strong role, but it's coming. The work in India, in Pune, and in IIIC in Bangalore is increasingly telling us that the monsoon could change suddenly. Quite difficult to know how, but it could. It's clear that the glaciers and snows are retreating, and so the whole stability of those water flows off the Himalayas will change. And that will be hard, you know. Overall, the quantity of water will go up probably, but you know, there'll be torrents in some periods and droughts in others. So if you put the monsoon change, the water flows off the Himalayas, and in this part of the world, northeast India and Palanpur and so on, like northeast China, it looks as though with unmanaged climate change, I mean, that's, of course, the name of the game is to try to manage it, and we talk about how, but with unmanaged climate change, the basic heat in the summer could well be above human toleration, the combination of heat and humidity, above human toleration. That means that, roughly speaking, if so-called wet bulb temperatures go above 35 degrees centigrade, it's a combination of heat and humidity, you can't survive outside longer than a few hours. Well, of course, it's not going to be hot all through the year, but you know, that's long enough to kill you in a day, right? So that kind of thing, you know, whether it's the torrents or absence of water flows down the Ganges and the other water systems, the changing nature of the monsoon, the overall heat is going to be a real issue. We don't know exactly when, but it's not far away. I mean, in the next 2-3 decades, big chunks of that will appear, and unless we act very strongly as a world, it'll get much worse than that over the second half of the century. So, but that is something that's in our hands, but it's not in the hands of the villagers of Palanpur, it's in the hands of the world as a whole, in which, of course, India is extremely important. I mean, the two most important countries in the world on virtually everything you look at are India and China. And so what they do will shape what happens to the rest of us.
So thanks a lot. Very sobering last comments, Nick. But thank you so much for coming and doing this with IDFC Institute. So Nicholas Stern, Himanshu, thanks.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you. No, it's very good of you, and thank you for your very thoughtful questions.